Hi everyone, and welcome back to the series I'm doing on the Major Arcana for the Tot Tarot, and it is pronounced Tot. The god is Tot. I know it sounds a little sillier than Thoth, just has a nice gentle sound to it. But every professor of religion I've ever heard talk about Tot says Tot. So in academia, it is pronounced Tot. Um, so, anywho, today we are talking about number 8. I realize I've been away from this for a few days, but I was doing, if you have noticed, that very big opening of the key reading. And the cool thing about that is that you can, I never quite finished that opening of the key tutorial I had wanted to do. And so now you can at least see what goes into the other operations. The system I used for them was more what Crowley says in his Book of Thoth, as opposed to other systems. And really, the only relevance of that is counting for the aces 11 and the way I paired. But anywho, that's not related to this video. Um, so today we're talking about number 8, Adjustment, which is one of the more important cards as far as I suppose as far as dogma is concerned for the Tot deck, because of course Crowley wasn't really big on dogma, and so when you have it in the rare instances that you do, it's important to really focus on that. And I think the dogmatic aspect begins with the fact that we are told that she is the complement of the fool, that she's his dancing partner, so to speak. She is the Harlequin, which explains all these little like checkerboardish sort of motley patterns behind her. Um, so that's certainly a big deal, because the idea is that the fool is the letter Aleph, as we know, as we talked about in the first video, but adjustment is the letter Lamed, and first of all, when you put them together, you get the name Al, which is an important name for God. Coffee, cheers. Um, it's an important name for God, and it's also the name of the book of the law, Libra Al. But more I guess more interestingly is that it is a name of God. Al Adonai you see sometimes, and El is sometimes seen as the same thing, I think. El Adonai, Al Adonai, it's the same general idea. Um, so the two of them essentially comprise the, I suppose, the dualistic vision of God to some extent, or just the two major facets of of God. Um, of course, we've already talked about how the Fool is very much about that. The other thing too is that the Fool, Aleph means an ox, and Lamed means an ox goad. And of course, an ox goad is a thing that you put on the collar of an ox if you're using it as a beast of burden, and it essentially, is meant to keep the animal subdued and basically under your control, so that you can get it to plow for you. So, so adjustment is right off the bat going to be a card that talks a little bit about restriction, but it's important to not think of the restriction in terms of what we usually think of self-restriction, um, because usually in general Western culture we like to think of restriction as things like chastity. We like to think of it as self-sacrifice. We like to think of it as altruism. Um, the idea is that none of these are necessarily moral in and of themselves. That it's not necessarily a good way to live because some overarching God has told you that you must do so. Um, because of course thelemic morality is very, very, very gray, um, and I think very fluid and is entirely based on the individual. And I think the idea, as we'll come to see in the Devil, And I think I may have talked about it a little bit here in some of these videos, but I can't remember, to be honest with you. That that morality is something that has to be learned by experience over a number of lifetimes. That morality cannot just be imposed upon people. Um, or, I mean, of course it must be, because otherwise you would have total anarchy. And so there must be some system of law to keep people in place. But the idea with adjustment is that that ultimately the best person to determine one's morality is the individual themselves, with, of course, guidance from the holy guardian angel, from higher spiritual experiences, that sort of thing. It's not just saying, willy nilly that you can go about choosing to say awful things like, killing people is good. Obviously, that's not correct. And as I've said before, I think it's we always see that across the human board. Um, People generally agree that certain things are not good, and are bad to do to other people, like killing, or rape, or I mean, obviously there are things that no one can possibly condone. Um, and of course, we find Crowley condoning them every now and then because he's absurd like that. And I mean, I think with Crowley, you really have to take half of what he says in that vein with a grain of salt, because I really think he was just, sometimes he was really just trying to freak people out as much as possible. Um, and to what effect, you can debate, but but anywho, that aside, adjustment is about self order and self control, because it is the path. Lamed is the 19th path, or rather, yes, it is the 19th path that goes uh, from Geburah to Tiphareth. And so the Geburah is, of course, the uh, sometimes seen as the energy of man, but it's also the destructive aspect of man. It is the idea of minimalization in the material, or excuse me, in the world, basically. Because of course it's below the abyss and the tree of life. Above it we have existence that is not in extension, meaning not subjected to space and time. Um, but below the abyss, we have the concepts of space and time. And I really think that Chesed is really the concept of space, and Gibor is really the sense of time. I know that Crowley would disagree with me and say that, Bina is time, and Hochmans is space to some extent, or Nuit is space, and he says all these different things. And Hokmah being space because it is also associated with the 12 astrological signs, and so there's some concept of that. Um, but frankly, I disagree based on other philosophical modes that I like to keep in mind, particularly St. Thomas Aquinas would say, and using the Aristotelian model, sort of in conjunction with the Platonic model, would say that God, or the ideal, is not extended by matter or space and time. That matter is so corrupt, and that we experience separation from God because of the extension through space and time. Whereas in the supernal triangle, where we experience unity, one does not have that. It's sort of like those concepts of space and time are exaggerated to the point where they become the roots of the ideas of space and time. But really, for all intents and practical purposes, space and time, for me, reside in Chesed and Geburah, respectively. Um, but Geburah is also associated with Mars, and Mars is, of course, the god of war, and is very much opposite to Chesed, which is the god Jupiter, which is more about benevolence. So here we have destruction as opposed to the creation and construction of number four, of Chesed. So we have that energy, that destructive energy, descending um, upon Tiferet, which is the heart of man. It is the, I suppose, the true self in manifestation, to put it lightly, or to put it simply, rather. Um, so it is very much about self-restriction, is what I'm getting at. And the idea that, you know, adjustment is tough, but I think, and this is sort of also why I waited to do this video, because it is one of the more complicated cards, but I think it is another way of seeing that God is both chaos and order with the Fool because of the name All. And adjustment is very much about order. It's very much about how the life of the individual is constantly constructed based on the path of their true will. That one's because one can only be their real self, and the real self is synonymous with the true will. You can only ever follow your true will, um, whether you choose to or not. Obviously, the idea is that very few of us really realize what that true will is and really act to pursue it in all ways possible. Um, because otherwise, a lot of us would be probably a lot more happy. Um, but, oh, scheiße, what was I going to say? Shoot. But anywho, it's just this idea that, the ox goad, that even though we are beings of kind of infinite potential with the Fool behind us, we are also regulated. We have a path of orbit that we have to follow, that the universe wants us to follow so that it can stay in order. Um, it's getting at the logical aspect of the universe. I sometimes think of it in terms of like an equation or like a chemical equation. If you conceptualize the universe as one big equation, um, in which nothing can be added to it or taken away from it, which is a fact of physics, um, then essentially everything must always be accounted for, and that's what adjustment is really getting at. That any action that takes place on whatever plane must have an immediate reaction that essentially cancels it out, that essentially balances it out so that the whole system is readjusted back onto the track that it's supposed to be going on. Okay? Um, and all of us are part of that equation. We are almost like, it's almost like an algebraic equation where everyone is a different letter. Um, Obviously, there are more people than letters to choose from, but use your imagination. And it's sort of saying, you can't ever take one of those letters out, and you can't ever add another letter. But what that letter can do is change, and that is what perpetuates not only the illusion of the universe, but the universe itself. Um, as we talked about in the Lovers, that well, first of all, change of stability is the big idea for Crowley, but in the Lovers, we talked about how that separation of being is important for manifesting existence. It's the same sort of thing here on a more scientific kind of level. I mean, we know that if the universe ever reached absolute zero, it would, we don't really know what would happen, but we assume that it would fall apart and destroy itself, basically, because there would be no motion. Everything would be static, and that is ultimate death. So, so change is very important, and that is how we get the idea of reincarnation. I think the idea that we are all necessary for the equation of the universe, and we are all required to go through changes in order to keep it all moving. So I think this is what we're getting at with the combination of the Fool and adjustment, is that all of us have this true will, but it doesn't really matter necessarily how that true will is played out. Um, I think the actual, in other words, the literal, there's nothing very literal about the true will. The true will needs to be transcendent. It needs to be able to go beyond space and time. It needs to go beyond the present incarnation. because the true self is beyond the present incarnation. Um, it's very much the idea that um, the actual, maybe even specific events, or just I guess what I'm trying to say is that the true will is always going to be the same general idea. It's always going to take the same general path, but the way in which it plays out, or the circumstances in which it happens, are going to be different for every incarnation until basically you have completed it, and that is the completion of the great work, that you have completed your Father's will, so to speak, as Christ would say. Um, you have planted the seed, and it has finally borne fruit. And I think this is part of what we're getting at when Christ is talking to us about the whole need to plant things and leave things behind. Um, that it goes along with this idea of following God's will and completing it, and that one cannot ever rest until one has done so. So adjustment is about keeping things in motion, as we are also told she is the way life is kind of crazy, that's how she gets her harlequinness, that she's the whirling and ever-changing aspect of life that is constantly readjusting at every level, um, you know, including when non-visible levels, obviously. I mean, at all levels of life, it's working sort of almost like a computer, based on, again, that big equation idea that I was talking about. Um, she's a very interesting card. It's how we also get the idea of karma, the idea that whatever actions you do must have some sort of backlash, whether good or bad, and or reaction rather. And that reaction can take place now, or it can take place years from now, or it can take place lifetimes from now. Um, it's totally undetermined, and it's sort of based on when God wants you to feel it. And that then gets to the idea of God's justice. That God's justice is incredibly obtuse and very difficult to penetrate. Um, but we are told that we are supposed to penetrate it to the best of our abilities. That is the entire thing I think that Crowley is getting at with all of this. It's why he made a deck that was so esoteric, um, for average people. But the other thing that tells us this is that we have the sword of the magician in between her legs. Um, and we are told that she also represents the Hay final of Tetragrammaton. So, in other words, she is the lower consciousness of you and I, essentially upon, at the moment of receiving understanding and a degree of enlightenment, of reaching Bina and crossing the abyss. We're told that there is a throne behind her, um, and thrones are associated with Bina. Uh, and of course the old adage that the daughter of the mother is set upon the throne of the mother, and the revolving tetragrammaton formula we've talked about in other videos. But it's the same thing. Crowley was very big on talking about that formula as part of the formula of attainment, basically. That one must elevate the lower consciousness to a position of understanding one's complete connection to the universe around them, and to complete understanding of the divine true self within themselves. And to effectively die, it is effectively to destroy the ego and the limited sense of self that we have here and now, and to gain a sense of the eternal self that has never died, but has never really been either. That's the bizarre thing. It is in a constant state of becoming. Right, there's something for you to think about. But the idea of the Sword of the Magus is that it represents the willpower, um, and as well as um, well as the phallus, to be frank. But the idea that the will is masculine, The consciousness is feminine to some extent. Um, and the idea that we have to, I think this is really about being a reflection of love is the law, love under will. That was the big catchphrase of the Book of the Law. Um, that that is the law, to love under will. And of course, what that really is meaning is very complicated. Um, well, yes and no. I mean, some people make it very complicated, but I think it's fairly simple that love must be a choice. But of course, but do not let the fools mistake love, for there are love and love. Um, so that's the other thing too, is that it can't be the passive aggressive love that Western culture so favors. It has to be like a holy kind of love, a love that is very zealous. It's sort of the zeal of the Lord, and we'll talk about that when we get to lust, number 11, because lust is dreadfully misunderstood, in my opinion. But as far as adjustment, it's very much saying that love is the law, love under will, and also we get that because of the high amount of green in this card. If you can notice that, if you aren't colorblind, you will see that there is a lot of green in this card, and that is because the card also represents the sign of Libra, which is ruled by Venus, and Saturn is exalted in it. So, this this is very cool because of course the card is descending upon Tiphareth, and my computer is going to die. The card is the path descending from Geburah onto Tiphareth, and Tiphareth of course means beauty, and Venus is also a goddess of beauty. So there's some symmetry there as far as the associations are concerned. But also this idea of love, um, that all opposites must be weighed against each other, and essentially, um, I guess, just canceled out is the idea that love is about a canceling out. It's a harmony of opposites that produces kind of a zero effect. Um, Of course, that can either go forward and create something new in matter, or it can redissolve into nothingness. Um, so, the idea that we have in adjustment is that she has two things that she's weighing, the alpha and the omega. And the idea is that by using her will, it's the power of choice and is the power of free will. This card is very much about the power of free will, um, and the art of choice. Um, Free will and true will. Kind of confusing, but it is both because it also conveys this idea that eh, whatever choices you have, no matter how opposite they are, you must, the individual that is enlightened and is aware of the justice of God, um, basically must condense the two until they produce a third option, essentially, a third option that caters to, or adheres rather, to the path of one's true will. That it is unavoidable. The path of true will is entirely unavoidable, and it's the same thing as the light yoke of Christ, as some writers have talked about. That Christ's law is actually very easy to follow and is very wonderful, and it's a happy thing to follow the law. Um, this is the exact same idea, um, but on a different in a different system, obviously. So it is about love under will. It's about choosing to, you know, basically separate those two opposites, understand the framework of each opposing option that you have, and then using your will, you condense them in love and essentially obliterate them to the in the sense that neither of them any longer exists as a separate thing. but you have fused them into this thing where neither of them exist, but you have a new thing that's a conglomerate that adheres to true will. So, and of course, we are also told that she has the feathers of Ma'at on her head, the ostrich plumes, which is the Egyptian goddess of justice and balance. Um, and we are told that they are very mobile, that they are disturbed by the slightest action. And again, this just is part of the ox goad, that true will is entirely unavoidable, that everything you do is going to be weighed against it. That's the other idea. So of course, this card conveys a lot and a lot of philosophical ideas, but it is an air card, so what else would you expect? Um, so yeah, I am sure that there is more that people could add to this, but that's what I've come up with just, based on reading and meditation. So of course, if you have any questions, comments you want to add, by all means, please do so. And I look forward to doing what's next, number 9 with you, the Hermit. Okay, thank you very much. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and all that crap. Bye.